to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the fourth and final week in our series, Second Century of North Idaho, but we're also talking about the second century in the Northwest. We wish to conclude this series with a very distinguished guest. Today we welcome to the program Dr. Ben Bova. His credentials are long and very impressive, and I will only mention a few of those. Dr. Bova is the author of more than 68 futuristic novels and nonfiction books that deal with space and high technology. He has been involved in science and high technology since the very beginning of the American space program. He is a lecturer, an author, and travels extensively both here and other parts of the world to deal with his very exciting topic on futurism. He has written among his novels Privateers and Voyagers. They combine romance, adventure, and the highest degree of scientific accuracy to explore the impact of future technology. He has won many awards. He received the Science Fiction Achievement Award, called the Hugo, for Best Professional Editor 6 different times. He also has a book entitled The Fourth State of Matter that was voted one of the best science books of the year in 1971 by the American Librarians Association. I also want to recognize the fact that he has brought a book with him that's entitled Welcome to Moonbase, and I'm sure among our questions today that we will be involved with this publication that came out in 1987. In addition to the things that I've mentioned, he also was technical editor of Project Vanguard, the first American satellite project, and it's my understanding as of the taping of the program today, this is the 30th anniversary of that particular project. Dr. Bova, I could go on and on, but I want to allow time for questions from our panel. Welcome to North Idaho and to the Pacific Northwest, and we're delighted to have you on the program.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I'm very happy to welcome to the panel to assist in the questioning of our distinguished guest today. First of all, to my left, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney practicing in Idaho. Next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And our third panel member is Jean Ann Mitchell. And I want to personally thank Jean Ann for this outstanding week. She chairs the North Idaho College Convocation Series. I will ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Dr. Bova, to set the stage for our viewing audience, could you tell us why is it important to extend our minds beyond our mundane everyday activities and begin to think about space and to think about scientific progress and advancement?
Well, for one thing, the only way you can understand the limits of what is possible is by stretching further than that into the impossible. Human beings, I think, have always tried to grasp further than they can really reach. Space is important to us for a number of reasons. One is that in our global economy today, high technology is the key. The United States, for example, has seen its old standby industries like automobiles and steel largely captured by competitors from other countries. But high technology, the invention of new things, new techniques, handling information instead of hardware, is the key to a strong economic future. And space is the highest of the high technologies. It forces us to do our best. Right now, the United States economy gains something like $200 to $300 billion a year from industries that use the technologies we developed in the space program. So we get a return of 100-fold for every dollar we've spent on NASA. And
so you're talking now not only about the limitations of the Earth's supply, if you will, and the necessity to go into outer space or into space to extend the Earth's resources, but also to use the technology that's developed in space on the Earth.
I don't think we're anywhere near the limits of the Earth's resources. Where we stand today with constantly increasing population, with 5 billion people on Earth, and in another 10 years it'll be 6 billion, is that we are competing harder and harder for the Earth's share of resources. There's plenty to go around, but it's not distributed terribly well. So we have two alternatives. One is to fight over the way we distribute the Earth's resources. The other is to go out and find more resources, just increase the supply. And that space is good at. In the past 30 years, we have seen more natural resources than the entire planet Earth contains. the minerals, the metals, the energy that exist in space can literally make every human being on Earth a millionaire. It's all there. The question is going to be, who is going to get it? Who is going to develop this new frontier? And how will this wealth be brought to Earth and distributed?
In line with that, then, will the haves be the ones who have the resources to get into space and develop it? And what is the race for those?
Well, it's a peculiar thing. Certainly the richest nations are the ones who are going into space the soonest. The Soviet Union began the whole thing and is still well ahead of everybody else. The United States is second, perhaps third now. The Europeans, Western European nations, have an organization called the European Space Agency. They're moving very quickly. And the Japanese, the People's Republic of China has joined the game, and India. Now, nations like India, you think, would be too poor to afford to go into space. Yet, the economies of space offer very attractive things for a nation like India. It is much cheaper for the Indian government to put up a communications satellite than to try to string copper wires across the whole subcontinent. So there are things where you say, oh, it costs $100 million to launch a satellite. That's true, but it's cheaper than doing the same job in more mundane ways. So space does offer enormous economic benefits today. It's much more than Teflon frying pans. Whether you've gone hang gliding or God forbid, you've been in an intensive care unit in a hospital, you are using technologies derived from space. Our home computers, our whole information-based economy now is space-derived. And more is going to come.
Steve Sheen.
Dr. Bovee, you mentioned a moment ago how important high technology is going to be to the future development of the United States. There was a time not too long ago when this U.S. space program was sort of the shining light, the showcase for our technological superiority.
Yes.
What's happened to that program in the last few years?
Well, as we said earlier, this is the 30th anniversary of the first successful launch of a Vanguard satellite. That's why I celebrate St. Paddy's Day. What has happened to our space program consistently from the beginning, except for the few years of the Apollo project, has been an entire mismanagement from Washington. The politicians, and I really can't fault President Reagan because he's been very good for the civilian space program, but more particularly the Congress, has never supported space the way it should be. There has never been a strong sense of goal and purpose. There's never been the year-by-year development of a program and a technology. It's always been, each year the Congress says, well, how much money are we going to put into space? And then they keep whittling down that figure. The politicians view space as sort of an expensive hobby. It's very nice, and it's prestigious, and it's fun and exciting. It's a romantic scientific adventure. They don't understand that space is the key to this country's economic well-being. They don't understand there are 10 million jobs in the United States today that depend on space-derived technologies. They don't understand that the cameras we're using and the microphones we're using didn't exist before we started miniaturizing electronics.
Did the Challenger disaster help or hurt? It
hurt enormously.
It didn't create a sense of urgency in
Not at all.
Congress about we've got to fix this problem.
I've been all around the world, and I'll tell you, Washington is the worst city in the world to talk about space.
Very
There's
interesting.
much more understanding of the need for it in New Delhi than there is in Washington, D.C.
How's that attitude reflected in the general population, do you think?
Well, the American public, I think, shares that attitude to a large extent. They don't see the connection between satellites in orbit and the price of bread on their kitchen table. And yet some of those satellites observe the world's grain crops and give information to grain futures speculators, which determines the price of bread on your table. So they don't see the connections, and yet they are there.
Jean Ann Mitchell.
Yes, you mentioned a belief system of abundance, that it's out there if we can bring it in. And so we don't have to deal with scarcity anymore, or we can put that off for a while. So my question is, how do we develop the person that we need, the personality that we need?
Well, I suppose there are two things we can do in the United States. One is to just keep going the way we are, and these personalities will develop in Russia and China and Japan, and we will become essentially a third world nation. The other is, and it revolves, I think, largely around education and the media. that we have to get the information across to the public. We
and
have to
that
draw
would
the
include
connections.
cooperation.
International programs, sure, yes. The United States is engaged in many of them.
Okay, you mentioned a minute ago this disconnectedness between the scientist and the person sitting with their loaf of bread on the table. How do you make that connection there?
Well, I've been trying to do it for years now, and obviously not with enormous success.
Not with enormous success.
It's, you know, my degrees are in communications, and it's very tough to deconvince someone to set up, to destroy an old set of beliefs and to bring in a new one. Most people have been convinced from the very beginning, from the time of Sputnik, that space is an adventure. It's got some political prestige attached to it, but it's mainly for Carl Sagan and an elite group of scientists and astronauts. And to their discredit, I think, the scientists foster this. You listen to James Van Allen, the discoverer of the Van Allen belts, and he says, why send astronauts into space? They just take money away from me. You know, let's do science in space and that's it. They do not understand that there's an economic frontier that begins 100 miles over our heads. And the powerful nations of the 1990s and beyond will be those who get a strong part of their economy from space technologies. That's the message that I'm trying to get across. That's why I wrote Welcome to Moonbase. That's an employee's manual for people who will work on the moon. It's a little ahead of its time, but it will tell you what the opportunities are, what the economic and industrial opportunities are, and draws a speculative scenario of how a moon base will be built and what it would be like to live and work there.
Dr. Bowe, you have built the bridge for me. My question was going to deal with the future, and with all your great expertise, we must take advantage of that today. In relation to this book and also your address before the students at North Idaho College, I understand you're going to deal with this. Give us some insight to the future, and you indicate that that we will have industry and so forth on the moon. Just give us this view into the future.
When I say we, I mean the human race.
Yes.
I don't necessarily mean Americans. I don't necessarily mean the United States. Half a century ago and more, Henry Luce said this is the American century. The 20th century is the American century. Well, we're coming to the end of the 20th century. And the question before this country is the 21st century going to be an American century? Or are we going to sink down into second or third rate economic power? And recognize that the strength of your economy determines the freedom of the people. Poor people can't be free. We are a very rich nation, but we are losing a lot of the drive and a lot of the things that made us rich. What I see for the future is the inevitable development of technologies. You can look on human history as the development of technology, as the ability to use more and more sophisticated tools. We started out with sticks and we learned to make fire. Today we use nuclear fires, and our sticks have become very sophisticated indeed. We can fly into space, we can live at the bottom of the sea, and that technology determines how well we can utilize the resources around us and how wealthy and therefore how free we can make ourselves. When we do not continue to develop the highest of our technologies, when we do not use our minds and our spirits to the fullest, nation decays. You can see this in many European empires that have gone their way, as far back as Rome or as recently as the British Empire. Now, interestingly enough, England is coming back economically. The southern part of England is in the midst of an economic boom based on new electronics industries. Again, from space technology.
Give us some insight to what life would be like for those who will be living on the moon and the travel back and forth from this planet.
Well, travel times can be anywhere from 3 days to a few hours, depending on how urgent your trip is. It's cheaper to go the slow route. Living on the moon in the time that I'm talking about at Moonbase, I'm envisioning a community of about 2,000 people. The economic rationale for the community is largely mining and processing metals taken from the lunar surface, and building electronics and space hardware. There are some very interesting things you can do on the moon. You can make gemstone diamonds out of methane gas. thanks to the high vacuum on the moon surface and the low gravity. You can build factories that are in vacuum so that we think of vacuum as dangerous. You know, there's no air to breathe. But for many chemical and metallurgical processes, vacuum is important. In the first place, it's very clean. It's empty. You can make new kinds of metal alloys and leave them in vacuum, and all the impurities, the gaseous impurities in them, will bubble away. They will outgas, leaving you with a metal that is much stronger than anything you can make on Earth. Now, here on Earth we have some vacuum processing, but it costs a lot of money to make nothing here. I worked in research laboratories for years, and I still dream about the clatter of vacuum pumps running day and night just to get the air out of a chamber about this size so you can do a little experiment. On the moon, you have a surface area the equivalent of North, South, and Central America combined, and it's all in a much better vacuum than you can make at any price on the Earth. So you're going to see vacuum-based industry, something very new, very different from what we do on Earth. And this, of course, will have an effect on the economies of nations and societies on the ground here on Earth.
Thank you. Janelle Bird.
I'd like to continue on with this line of questioning. In terms of the moon, is that a base for further expansion?
Oh,
is
yes.
that a doorway and a gateway? And can you tell us a little bit about what you foresee, where we'll be going from the moon?
Well, you know, I live in New England, and Oliver Wendell Holmes in the 19th century, senior, referred to Boston as the hub of the solar system. Well, in the 21st century, the moon is going to be the hub of the solar system. It will be the transportation node from which we expand throughout the inner solar system and beyond to the planets like Jupiter and further. Because of its low gravity and its airlessness, its vacuum, you can launch material off the moon for pennies a pound, where it costs thousands of dollars per pound on the Earth. So the moon will become a very important transportation node. The raw materials in the moon's surface and the moon's rocks will give you oxygen, silicon for making electronics components, iron, aluminum, titanium. You will find all of these things will be very important for supplying the expansion of the human race through the solar system. In the 19th and early 20th century, the United States expanded west of the Mississippi, and one of the big centers of that expansion was in Missouri. A lot of wagon trains left from towns like Independence. The moon is going to be that kind of a center in the 21st century, where the expansion across this new frontier that is hundreds of millions of miles wide will start from the moon. The materials, the machinery, the supplies will be from there. The people will come from Earth. We're not going to see enormous numbers of human beings migrating into space to live there. Only a few, maybe as few as a couple of million in the first decades of the 21st century. But what they do will transform the Earth. They will begin the process of making the human race far wealthier than anyone today dreams they can be.
Now, how will
Almost anyone.
How will man overcome some of the problems that exist in space? For example, the heat or the cold of other planets. How will we overcome those problems?
I don't think we're going to operate on other planets so much. The moon will be an important place, and bases will be put on the surface of the moon, mainly because the resources are there and they're easier to get at than taking the resources from the Earth. On the moon, you will live underground. Someone once asked Arthur Clarke, a fellow science fiction writer who lives in Sri Lanka in a tropical paradise, and said, "Arthur, how can you recommend people living in space in a totally artificial environment?" And Arthur said, "Well, you really should ask a friend of mine, Isaac Asimov. He lives in New York City." Now, there are lots of people who live in very artificial environments today. The moon base that I'm talking about is mainly underground. It is climate controlled. And you have more living space than most people in large cities do today.
And what kind of cooperation is this going to take between countries and between individuals and between man? A lot of cooperation?
An enormous amount. But what I see today already happening is a blurring of the lines of nationalism. I'm envisioning a moon base that is run by a multinational corporation whose major stockholders are the governments of 15 industrialized nations. A few miles away from Moon Base, about 1,000 kilometers, is a Russian base called Lunagrad. And the two work together very, very closely and jointly build a third base on the far side of the moon for astronomical research. What I've seen in our space programs to date is that the scientists and the astronauts and cosmonauts cooperate quite easily. It's the governments that have other fish to fry and cause problems. But I believe when people do live far from the surface of the Earth, the political squabbles of Earth are going to be left behind to a large extent. They'll still be human beings. They're not going to turn into angels. They will still bring their attitudes and their fears and their hopes with them. But living on a new frontier where a simple mistake could kill not only you but everyone around you very quickly, I think will force new attitudes. It will be much more important to stay alive than to quibble over political ideologies.
Steve Sheen.
Dr. Boba, I haven't read Welcome to Moonbase, so I intend to.
There'll be a quiz after the show.
I was afraid of that. From our discussion, I take it that the intent is primarily scholarly. You're making a serious effort at trying to project what life on the moon, working conditions on the moon, will be like.
The intent is really pedagogical, to teach people, to open their minds to this, as your original question began, to show people what it's like. It's very much easier for people to look in the other end of the telescope instead of saying, arguing today, here we are and this is what we should do. I wrote Welcome to Moonbase from the other end of the telescope. I said, it's the 21st century, here's Moonbase, and this is how we got here. Now, it's a speculative scenario, but it does demonstrate what can be done.
In addition to that work, you've produced, authored some nearly 70 fictional works, science fiction efforts. Is there any difficulty for you in making that transition, and do you see a benefit, a real sort of a preparation? Do you lay any groundwork with your fiction work for people to understand what the future is going to be like, to become excited about it?
Well, to me, writing fiction and then writing nonfiction is like a physicist who considers theory and then experiment. The two go hand in hand, because the kind of science fiction I write is not what you see on television or in the movies. It's not, adventure stories with laser guns zapping away. What I deal with is the possibilities of the relatively near future, the way that science and technology interacts with politics to change human lives and human capabilities. So writing the nonfiction helps me to learn more about the real scientific and technological possibilities. Writing the fiction helps me to understand how human beings will react to these things, how human lives will be affected. Fiction is more real than nonfiction in the sense that it involves human beings. And that is very important. The best futurist reports are usually wrong because they do not and cannot consider human reactions to new technical capabilities.
We talked before the show, and you mentioned that you're working on another
novel right now, yes.
Can you tell us anything about that, or is that something the publishers and the editors forbid?
Oh, no. Publishers and editors have no power to forbid anything, nor should they. What I'm working on right now is the very beginnings of a novel about the publishing industry itself and the transition from books made of paper to books made of an electronic book, an object you can hold in your hand with a screen on it that will give you page by page just about any book you want. And the resistance of the publishing industry to this, which would be about, I think, 1,000 times more resistance than they put up to the printing press originally back in the Middle Ages.
Jeanette Mitchell.
And you're seeing out there, if you're using a telescope and looking back, what do you see in 50 years, 100 years, as far as culture and sociology? One language, one government, is that a possibility? Do you see those things?
I think 50 years from now, probably not a single government legally, but we will have, in fact, a global economy that is run by a handful of multinational corporations.
Will they will be making the government?
Yes.
They will then become the government.
Oh, we'll still vote for senators and presidents and whatnot, but the multinational corporations will effectively be running the world. And frankly, that's not a scenario that I'm very happy with, but I think those are the trends of the way things are going today.
And the
if there is
individual cultures, what will happen there?
Oh, they tend to blend and homogenize more and more. That's an aspect of communications that is in some ways regrettable. Before the advent of direct dialing on telephones in this country, you could have the charming adventure of listening to a Boston operator trying to get across to an Atlanta operator. And they're both speaking English, but neither one can really understand the other. Now, you know, with television, you know, I travel quite a bit. I go from city to city, turn on the local news, and they're the same people speaking with the same dialect, wearing the same jackets and the same hairdo, and giving me the same bad news. But cultures will homogenize. It's very, very difficult. Now, anthropologists are really scratching around looking for pristine cultures where they can study groups that have not been affected by Western civilization. In the 1940s, American Seabees began giving steel hatchets to headhunters in New Guinea. Now the children of those headhunters are running Hilton hotels in New Guinea.
What about language? Are we going to continue the growth of language in one direction, English, and then absorb the
English
other
is
languages?
taking over a large part of the world. It is the international language of science. It's the international language of air travel. Generally, language has followed the sword. The most powerful political nations are the ones whose language other people speak, which leads me to think that eventually we'll all have to learn Chinese.
Why Chinese?
Because they're going to rule the world.
You see that at how far?
Oh, about 1,000 years from now. The Chinese are very patient, but they keep working at it.
Dr. Bowe, we have about 30 seconds, and the political arena has a lot to do with what happens in policy and programs. Do you see anyone on the political scene that can maybe articulate, as you have today, the real benefits of space?
No, not a one of them.
I'm sorry to have to end on this note. I wish we could continue. I would love to pursue that, but time does not permit. On behalf of our panel and our staff, Dr. Bowe, we thank you. You have been one of our most outstanding guests and most articulate and exciting with your ideas.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks to the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this series that we have had on this very important topic, and I think the Convocation series again, and we've been delighted to have Dr. Ben Bove, a futurist, dealing with this very exciting subject. Please be with us again next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.